The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. German Chancellor Angela Merkel's open-door policy in the current refugee crisis has long met with resistance by the German right. Opposition is becoming increasingly widespread, however, in the wake of incidents like the mass assaults that occurred in Cologne and other German cities on New Year's Eve. Once seen as the unassailable champions of the European project, Ms. Merkel's government now faces challenges across a wider swath of Germany's political landscape. Here to explore the impact of the refugee crisis and Chancellor Merkel's response is having on the nation's domestic politics and relations with its EU neighbors, we're joined by Peter Staudenmaier, Assistant Professor of History at Marquette University, where his research and teaching focus on modern Europe. Peter, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Well, I wonder if we could start out with this sort of a German politics 101. Who are the players? Who are the big parties? Who's in? Who's out?
Sure. The current German government is a strange hybrid. I try to explain it to my American students sometimes by saying, imagine if the Republicans and the Democrats, this is hard to imagine right now, but imagine if Republicans and Democrats, neither one of them could get enough votes to govern, so they had to form a coalition with each other. Something similar is the case in Germany. Germany doesn't just have two parties, it's got 5 or 6 viable parties represented in the national parliament. And right now, the two largest parties, the center-right party, that's the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, and the center-left party, the Social Democrats, they are in an unusual and somewhat unsteady coalition with one another for the past 2 years. Now, Merkel's been chancellor for now almost 11 years, but the last 2 of those years have been, dealing with partners that she doesn't share a lot in common with politically.
And traditionally, sort of on the right-left spectrum, her party was about as far right as you could get and be viable. Wouldn't you say that's fair?
Not necessarily. I see what you mean, but they do have a smaller coalition partner that exists only in Bavaria.
Right.
Bavaria is a very important part of Germany. That party's further to the right. And Merkel is by no means the furthest right member of her own party. So in a certain sense, she's one of the few political figures in Germany today that you could imagine trying to bring together the broad center of Germany's political culture. She is still very popular personally. Now, that popularity has been declining over the last year and a half or so, but in some ways, she's more popular as a person and as a politician than her own party is at this point.
And then what about further on the left? We have, who do we have?
A whole series of parties. The Social Democrats were traditionally the major center-left party. They have often, in the post-war period, they have often been the ruling party. They haven't been recently. They've often had the chancellor job. Then there's a party called simply the Left, or the Left Party. That's a descendant of the former Communist Party of East Germany from 30 years ago. And then there's the Green Party, which is hard to locate exactly on the political spectrum, but falls more or less in the left, broadly speaking. There's also a middle party, the Free Democrats, that are sort of socially liberal, but also in favor of what Americans would consider generally conservative fiscal and economic policies. The up-and-coming party right now, I'm sort of sorry to say because I'm not fans of them, is a group called the Alternative for Germany. They're a hard right party. They are well to Merkel's right, and they have been one of the harshest critics of her and her party's stance on immigration policy for the past couple of years.
And really had their origins as more of an EU skeptic party,
That's
right?
exactly right. There are a lot of parties in various different member countries within the European Union that have made a lot of political capital out of people's degrees of discontentment and dissatisfaction with the direction, or lack of direction for that matter, that the EU as a whole, that the European Union as a whole seems to be taking. And in Germany, that discontent has coalesced around this new, relatively new Alternative for Germany party.
And to what extent do you think there's a uniquely German sense in that we're the engines driving this thing. Why should we be stuck with the bill? Why should we have to deal with all of the less fortunate Europeans?
It's a good question. That's a very common sentiment. Germany is the largest, most productive, most successful economy in all of the European Union, and in a certain sense, it's the financial anchor for the whole union, and Germans are often acutely aware of that. Either they're proud of it or they're sometimes unsettled because it does, in fact, mean a higher level of responsibility for German workers, for German owners, for just folks who live in Germany and make their living there. And that is one of the several potential sources of resentment. If you're from a more prosperous part of Europe, in very broad terms, from Northern Europe, generally speaking, you often will have, or it's at least tempting to have, a sort of a kind of frustration that the less prosperous parts of Europe, broadly speaking, Southern Europe, who aren't doing so well right now economically, that you have to you feel like you have to foot the bill for the problems that they're facing wherever it might be, in Spain or in Greece or in Italy or what have you. From a broader historical perspective, in fact, from a broader macroeconomic perspective, that frustration is understandable. It doesn't make a lot of economic sense, but you could see how it would get translated into political dissatisfaction.
Well, and there's almost a moral component to this, isn't there? It's like, well, these people in the profligate South are sailing around in the Aegean and having a good time while we're at the BMW plant slogging it out every day.
That's a very widespread opinion in Germany. I think it's almost completely false, but the true part is Germans work really hard. They're very proud of their work ethic. There's a very high degree of productivity, very high levels of efficiency. A lot more investment has gone into the more productive parts of the German economy. So again, I don't think it's true economically. It's certainly not true historically, but I think we can see why for a lot of Germans it feels like, why do we have to carry everyone else in the EU on our back? We're getting kind of tired. Let's put those other folks down for a minute.
But in the issue of this recent surge of immigration, that certainly hasn't been the Merkel government's position. I mean, she's been uniquely welcoming. And what do you think are the origins of that historically?
That's a good question. Merkel's own position has been something of a surprise. For those of us who have watched her since she's been in office with different coalition governments since 2005, I kind of admire the way she has had this steady hand, very steady, calming voice throughout the growing sense of crisis that a lot of Europeans are feeling. Now, German refugee policy in general, what Germans would normally call their asylum policy, that has long been, since the Federal Republic of Germany was founded right after World War II in the late 1940s, that German policy toward refugees in general has long been one of the most open of any European country at all. And there's good historical reasons for that. A lot of the people who wrote Germany's constitution, what they call the Basic Law in German, a lot of those people in the late 1940s, they had themselves just recently returned from exile, if they were lucky enough to escape Hitler's Germany. They got out in time, and if they were lucky enough to find a country that would take them in, which was not always the case, including here in the US in a lot of cases, if they had found exile, and then they came back after the final defeat of Hitler, and their job was essentially, we have to recreate the German body politic from scratch. And a lot of those people, because of their own experience of having been saved through having been granted political asylum from Hitler's Germany, they insisted on writing into the Constitution or the Basic Law a very straightforward and kind of open-ended right to asylum. No ifs, no ands, nor buts. Now, that policy has been changed and amended, especially from the mid-1980s onward, the 1990s in particular. There were some changes for better and for worse by my lights. Nonetheless, still today, there is a long-standing German tradition of saying we are going to welcome with open arms anybody who comes here and who can make a plausible case that they face some kind of persecution, discrimination, violence, or some sort of threat in their homeland. And Germans, some Germans, Merkel among others, have insisted on sticking to that principle even over the last year and a half or so, where it has gotten increasingly politically difficult for them to do so. And part of the reason for that is simply the huge numbers involved. There's about 80 million people in Germany these days, again, the largest country in all of Europe, in the European Union, about 80 million Germans, and just in 2015 alone, just in that 12-month period, 1.1 million refugees arrived in Germany. That's a huge number that has, in some ways, overwhelmed the structures that the German government and that the German provincial governments and state governments, the structures that they had set up to try to be as welcoming as possible.
Well, if you just put that in an American context, that would be something around 4 million people coming to the U.S. in a year.
It's a huge number, just in a 12-month period. And there were large numbers in 2014 and 2013 as well. So when you have that kind of, when the systems that even the seemingly most generous and most open, or one of the most open governments in all of the European Union, when you see those structures start to break down under the pressure of just increasing numbers, it creates at least a perceived problem that puts people like Merkel and those in her party who support her, not all of them do, it puts them in an increasingly tough position.
And beyond just scale, there are a lot more people trying to get in than before. Is there a component of who they are, their countries of origin, and how does that play into this?
It definitely plays a role I would say, for good reasons and for bad. A lot of the people who are coming now, the largest single group, as far as we can tell, some of this has happened so fast and so overwhelmingly that we don't necessarily still have reliable data for all the 2015 newcomers, but a whole lot of them appear to be coming from Syria, a conflict that people watching this show will have been paying attention to over the last couple of years. And those are people who, it seems to me, have an obvious, very plausible tale of, my life is in danger, my family is in danger if we don't get out right now. A lot of those people would dearly love to be able to return home to their homes in Syria when and if they can. Other folks coming in and trying to find more permanent forms of asylum, some of them coming from various parts of North Africa, various other parts of the world, some of those people would rather see if it's possible for them to build a new life in a new place, whether that's Germany or moving on to some other part of the EU. Maybe they eventually want to move across the Atlantic, who knows, but they have a different life plan and want to see if it's possible for them to pursue their dreams in a place where they feel like they're not under constant threat to their livelihood and their well-being. So some of the cultural clashes that have come to the fore lately, certainly on the German side, have played a very important role in shaping people's perceptions, shaping a lot of Germans, ethnic Germans, long-term Germans, shaping a lot of their perceptions about who exactly do I feel like I am welcoming here. And that, I think, is one of the ways that the events in Cologne on New Year's Eve ended up taking this very unfortunate spin, especially the way that they were presented in some media accounts. Some media accounts were very responsible, did some very good investigation, did some very good reporting. Others have been playing up a lot of those stereotypes of a supposed culture clash, and I think that's really unfortunate. It makes it harder for us to think in the hard, tough ways that we're going to have to think through the proportions of this issue and try to come to ways to resolve it.
Well, we can talk a little bit about that sort of post-Cologne response if we could, but first we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing the politics of German immigration with Peter Staudenmaier from Marquette University. Well, you talked about the assaults in Cologne and other places on New Year's Eve. So what has been the immediate pushback from that?
Well, it's all over the map these days. The tricky thing with talking about this, in fact, it's paradoxically, I think it's harder to talk about it now in the wake of all the media attention, you would think the opposite would be the case. But the way a lot of the incidents have been framed in a lot of press reports, this is the #1 story in the German press since the beginning of the year, and it's gotten a whole lot of attention right here in the US press as well. And one of the paradoxical things is, if you try to talk about it in a sort of reasoned way and try to analyze the situation, it sometimes makes you feel like you have to choose a side. You have to pit one set of rights against another. Either I'm going to support women's rights, or I'm going to support migrants' rights or immigrants' rights. I think that's a false choice, but it's one that is suggested to us. Now, there have been groups in Germany that have been capitalizing on these events to use them as a way to sort of polemicize against the very presence of refugees, period, indiscriminately using this as something to blame refugees for. That's a common dynamic, unfortunately, when things like this happen, when things happen that should never happen at all, even if some of the press reports have been exaggerated and overblown. Nonetheless, let's say that only 10 people had been attacked instead of hundreds. It's still the kind of thing that should never happen anywhere to anybody. So some of these groups have said we have to use this as a way to say these refugees are never going to be assimilated into our culture. They're never going to be able to be a part of our society.
Well, let's talk a little bit about one of those groups, Pegida.
That's right.
And who are they?
Sure. Pegida, their name stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamicization of the Western World, or of the Occident, if you will. That is a group, we mentioned the Alternative for Germany a while ago. Pegida is sort of they're even further to the right than the Alternative for Germany. They are a good example of a sort of xenophobic populist movement. We have movements like this all over. We have them right here in the United States. Right now, even as we speak, they certainly have a long and obvious tradition in Germany as well. Pegida sees its task as essentially standing up for good Christian, European, Western cultural values, and they see those values threatened often by the mere presence of people who come from Muslim-majority countries. It doesn't matter what those people do or don't do, just the fact that they're here in Germany in relatively large, recognizable numbers is a problem from the point of view of Pegida. But to be clear, there are lots of other folks in Germany. Germany has a very broad spectrum of political opinion. There are lots of other groups in Germany that have taken essentially the exact opposite set of lessons from the events in Cologne. Just to mention one, there's a really interesting group of feminist activists in Germany, both ethnic Germans and Turkish Germans, sort of multicultural German feminist activists, and they have taken the stance that says, look, let's think about this for a second. Things like sexual intimidation, sexual harassment, unwanted sexual conduct, these are not things that just suddenly popped up out of nowhere on December 31st in a handful of cities. They say these are things that German women face all the time and have faced for years. So from that perspective, it just doesn't make sense to try to pin this on a relatively small group of refugees. They see it instead as a systematic problem, and they're hoping to use all of the attention around the Cologne events as a way to sort of finally get a conversation going about what is the real culture clash here? Is it really a culture clash between supposed Muslim values and supposed Christian or Western values? Or is it instead a culture clash that goes straight down the middle of German society itself, or straight down the middle of Western societies itself? There's a lot of people in Western countries who would not necessarily agree with the notion that women should be able to control what happens to their bodies. There's not a level of general social consensus about what does it mean to feel safe and secure when you go out at night or at the daytime as a woman. A lot of those things are very much contested values, even within just purely German communities, or for that matter, just purely American communities.
So, to what extent does this speak to a contested identity of what it means to be German? I mean, we saw a little bit of that earlier with the Turkish Gastarbeiters coming in.
Right.
Where they didn't look like Hans in his lederhosen, if you wanted to use that stereotype. So what does it mean to be a German in the 21st century?
That's a great question. A lot of Germans who have a longer historical memory, what they've experienced is basically the same set of people identifying themselves as German. If you look over the course of the last 150 years, more or less the same group of people who have occupied a sort of steadily shrinking territory, except during the Hitler years when it expanded greatly. It's sort of been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's hard for a lot of Germans to understand that what makes you German is not necessarily your ancestry or your lineage. What makes you German is the fact that you were born and raised in Germany, that you grew up speaking German, that you're participating in German culture. That is a hard lesson for a whole lot of Germans to learn. Now, a lot of them are learning it. It just takes a while. I would say it takes a generation or two for that insight to really establish itself. And I am hoping that things like the Cologne events don't totally derail that long-term process of recognizing that Germanness is not something that you're born with. It's something that you can participate in actively and make a choice about.
Well, we've seen the political pressure mount on Ms. Merkel's government to the point that there are now some changes in the laws, making it easier to deport people, for example. To what extent is she risking, if she goes too far in that direction, fracturing the coalition and people who were much more favorably disposed towards immigration?
That's right, Doug. She is walking a fine line. Because of the nature of the grand coalition and the center-left and the center-right together, whatever steps she and her advisors take, they're going to alienate somebody or other, either people in their own party or people in the other party that they depend on to maintain the government. It's hard to guess right now what direction they're going to take. My hope is that she will continue to say, we can do both of these things at once. We can have an open arms policy, and we can still insist that there are various things that you just can't do in our culture, in our society, and if you do them, you're going to face severe consequences.
So, we talked a little bit about the right and the pushback from that extreme segment of the German political spectrum. Talk, if you will, a little bit about how that connects with like-minded political groups around Europe.
The rest of Europe, sure. I think about that a lot. We have seen the last couple of years a real upsurge in a lot of far-right parties, not just in Germany. In fact, Germany has hardly been the worst. In places like France, particularly in the UK, of all places, which did not have a particularly strong history of far-right parties, a lot of those groups have been able to capitalize on the combination of the financial crisis starting in 2007, 2008, and then the inherent structural weaknesses built into the way the European Union was designed or misdesigned from the beginning. That combination of factors has made a wide opening for far-right parties to step in and say, look, a lot of you here, a lot of you Germans or French or Belgians or Danes or Britons or what have you, a lot of you are not happy with the way things are going. We have scapegoats for you. Look at all the brown people who've recently showed up around the corner. Look at those politicians spending all their time in Brussels doing nothing and making more regulations on your lives. It's a very easy way to sort of pin the blame on an identifiable group and say, if we get rid of those guys, we'll be able to go back to the way things supposedly used to be.
And do you think, given the 20th century history of Germany, that ascendancy of a German extreme right is somehow qualitatively different than
elsewhere?
Right.
I don't think so. I like that question. I would say no. In fact, if you ask me, in general, I think Germans have done a better job than most folks have in trying to, there's obviously exceptions, but in general, in trying to come to terms with the underside of their own history. If I had to compare it to what a standard German college student knows about and is able to talk in an informed way about their own history, about Nazism, et cetera, if I had to compare that to what a standard American college student is able to talk about with the history of slavery or the dispossession of Native Americans or Jim Crow or something like that, the German conversation is much more advanced, again, with obvious exceptions. So I think many Germans are working really, really hard to learn from their own mistakes in the past and not to repeat them. So when I see far-right groups, when they pop up, whether it's in Leipzig or whether it's in Paris or whether it's in Birmingham or London or someplace like that, I'm worried about what it says about the European fabric as a whole. I'm not especially worried about seeing it in a German context.
And there is a certain connection between skepticism about immigration and your skepticism Euroscepticism as well, is there not? I mean, those parties often share those same values?
There's a very clear link. The idea is that we French, or we Italians, or we whatever, we were better off in the supposed golden era before the EU started making all these regulations, before the borders came down with the Schengen Accords, before all of those hordes of immigrants started coming across our borders because they were open because of the EU. There's a very clear connections in some people's minds. One of the problems is there never was that golden age. It just never existed. It's easy to suggest that to people now because the problems that Europeans are facing right now are real. These are not imaginary problems. It's more that they are illusory pseudo answers to genuine problems.
So, what lies ahead, particularly for the Merkel government? Are they going to be able to walk that line?
Good question. Historians are reluctant to predict the future because we're almost always wrong. I think Merkel has been unusually resilient. I think that she will probably be able to pull off some sort of compromise that keeps her coalition together and still makes a workable refugee policy that doesn't simply collapse on itself and say, enough is enough, we're not letting any more people in.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it at that. Peter Staudenmaier, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Fascinating stuff. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,